Where have you been? Good afternoon. It's Friday. It's the 11th of September. We're a little late. We know that, but hey, fashionably late, hopefully, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the first ever BIDx, the UK's virtual festival for bid professionals. An extraordinary moment for us all. Thanks for bearing with us during that little technical hiccup. We are right back with you now. My name's Pete Morris, and I'm talking to you from the BIDx studios here in Manchester. Wherever you are in the world, thank you so much for joining us. We truly have an action-packed 90 minutes for you. But before we get into any of that, a couple of things that might help your enjoyment of today's show. If you can hear me and you can see me, my God, I hope you can, then you're obviously watching us via our app. That's either on your laptop, your tablet, or your phone. It is possible, some might even say preferable, to go to what young people call multi-gadget. Now, probably the best way to experience the next 90 minutes is to watch from your laptop or your tablet and have the app ready to interact on your phone. There are tons of ways that you can do that with us this afternoon. Please feel free to submit any questions to our guests. You can do that by going on the Submit Question tab on the app. Send anything you like in. I'll do my best to get as many of them answered for you as possible. You can also live chat with your fellow audience members. That's available right now, and it'll continue during and well after we come off air. That's on the social wall feature of the app. You might also want to take a look at the gamification feature, where you can win some frankly mind-boggling prizes. You can also apparently shake or tap your phone, I know that isn't the phone, during the show to interact with your fellow virtual audience members. Who knew, ladies and gentlemen? Unbelievable scenes. Now, the opening season of BIDx is all about evolution, not only in the bid and proposal industry, but also how we ourselves evolve. And today, our three guests are going to be focusing on finding opportunity in change. Let's get going. Our first guest describes himself as a reluctant futurist. He's also the best-selling author of An Optimist's Tour of the Future and We Do Things Differently. He's one of the world's most respected thinkers on technology and society. He works with governments, with corporates and arts organisations on how they can best deal with the future and adapt their culture accordingly. Oh, by the way, he's also a comedy writer. He had his first play, Octopus Soup, tour the UK last year. Our first ever BIDx guest speaker is Mark Stevenson. Mark, are you there?
I am. I'm here again.
You're here again. You know what? It seems like, what, half an hour ago?
In so long, I had that experience. I started speaking, and obviously I was speaking to going away, trying to say stuff, and actually speaking. Nobody was listening. I think that's very much a similar experience to sort of being a parent quite a lot of time, isn't it? Just carrying talk, but nobody's responding.
Mate, I completely agree. I was listening to you, Mark. Be rest assured in that regard. But we're a little bit behind time, so I'm going to stop talking. Ladies and gentlemen, as I just said, feel free to submit any questions you want to Mark. I'll pick up as many as I can at the end. Mark, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you, everybody, for listening. As Pete said, I describe myself as a reluctant futurist, and that's generally because I think the world of futurism is a slightly shabby profession. No qualifications for being a futurist. And generally, most futurists seem to think that technology is the answer to everything, that it will save us, whereas I'm much more a systems thinker, and I'm interested in the roots of things like inequality, or why our democracies don't work as well as they should, or those kind of things. And it tends to be that the futurists don't really have that historical kind of systemic background to their thinking. So what I do, I guess, is help my clients become literate about the questions that the future is asking us, about things like inequality, climate change, the failure of the markets to price risks properly, that kind of stuff. And then I help them try and answer those questions well in the service of making the world more sustainable, more equitable, more humane, more just in the way they invest, the way they recruit, the way they go about their business or organise their supply chains or whatever it is, so that we might actually have a future worth passing on to our children. And as was mentioned by Pete, I have a bit of a side career in the arts as a songwriter, comedy writer, playwright. And that's very, well, it's because I enjoy doing it, but also I have this very firm belief that the brain does the PR for what the heart has already decided. And therefore, I think it's really important to keep up those storytelling skills and emotional sort of literacy skills that allow you to speak to the emotion. And I find that very handy in the boardroom. So let's get on with it, and let's just talk about where we are now, because of course where we are now is a very strange place, as evidenced by the fact that we are online and not all in the room together. And I have to say that the coronavirus pandemic, really, we have to think of as a fairly easy training day for what's going to come next. It's going to be a very volatile 20, 30, 40 years, what some people are calling the long emergency, where we're like to see systemic shocks time and time again. Because we haven't really understood our relationship with the planet and ourselves. So the pandemic, was long overdue anyway, but also because of the way we've been treating the planet, it's much more likely we're going to have a more coming along the line. There's the obvious things of recession and inflation that brings along. And then there's the big one, which of course is climate change, which will make coronavirus look like a storm in a teacup unless we do something pretty radical about it, and very soon. One of my clients, very successful billionaire entrepreneur, said this rather brilliant thing. He said, when the tide goes out, you find out who's got their underwear on. And it turns out that the tide has gone out. And for a lot of us, whether that's a nation or an organization or an individual, we've been found quite wanting in the underwear department, many of us. Philip K. Dick, the science fiction author, says this rather brilliant thing. He says, reality is that which, when you stop believing in it, doesn't go away. And reality isn't going away. But actually, to be honest, it was pretty bad before the pandemic. It wasn't like everything was good, was it? I mean, democracy was in retreat, still is. We had mass inequality. Our healthcare systems are not healthcare systems. They're really expensive and labyrinthine sick care systems. You're dealing with the fallout of having unhealthy populations because we have economies that basically make us unhealthy. I said climate change is the big one that, we're heading for a 3-degree world at the moment, which is basically the end of civilization as we know it. And all that leads to mass employee disengagement, because we realize that the things we care about as human beings, we're being asked to check in at reception when we go into work. And so we realize we're kind of being asked to be complicit in this system where most of the rewards go to some distant 1% and the planet's getting destroyed and our children's future is being compromised. Our salaries now we see as much as bribery as they are reward. I think this is all nicely summed up by the great cartoonist Tom Toro. Did a great cartoon in the New Yorker. Some of you may have seen it. It's a picture of 3 small children outside a burning city, an adult in a slightly crumpled business suit saying to them, yes, the planet did get destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of value for shareholders. So we really do have to remember right now, all of us, that, as Gaylord Nelson said, the great American senator, that the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment, not the way around. And we've been treating it the way around, as if the environment is just something we can dump our waste into with no consequence. We've also discovered very recently that your economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of how good your healthcare system is as well. So the translation here for all of us, as parents, as colleagues, as professionals, if you're a business owner, is any investment of your time or your money that doesn't consider the environment or human health isn't an investment. Is an investment. It's a cost. It's a cost on the future you're probably going to pay in your pension, being worth a lot less than it was. And if we carry on like this, you may end up that your children have to pay with it with their lives, depending on where you live in the world. So any proposal management professional who isn't literate about this stuff is on the wrong side of history, I'm afraid to say. But the good news is there's chance to change. So when the rickety house starts to fall down, as it is all around our ears, you don't want to build that old rickety house back, do you? You want to go and build something better and shinier and newer and more fit for purpose. And the thing is, we're not going to go back. We're not going to go back to how things were. I mean, we kind of got back after 2008, but 2008 was a crisis of the intellect. It was a crisis of numbers. Now, this crisis is also both of those things, but it's more fundamental. It's a crisis of the soul, of the heart, of our ethics and how we think about society and how we interact with each other. And it's going to change everything. I've been doing a big job with some architects just recently. And I was just talking to them yesterday about how the entire built environment is going to change, because business districts are going to be much smaller. We've all realized we don't need city centre offices with huge rents. But that's going to have a knock-on effect for all those cafes and restaurants that serve that. It's going to have a massive knock-on effect on the public transport system, as we realise that cities like London, where I live, for instance, will become much more like villages that are highly networked rather than these big central business districts. And then we'll have to rethink residential development, because people are now going to be looking for houses or places where they can work as well as be with their family. It's going to be sort of a hybrid thing. So that's just one industry I've been working with this week. So the pandemic, really, I like to say, is a mirror that we're looking into. and and forcing us to look at ourselves afresh. Now, there's two ways an extreme is to look into a mirror. At one extreme, you can look into it like Narcissus, which is, as you probably know, is the myth of the Greek hunter, very beautiful, who fell in love with his own reflection and actually killed himself because he couldn't have his heart's desire. And I've seen organizations, indeed governments, look into this pandemic mirror that way, basically saying, don't worry, it'll all get back to normal. We'll return to where we are. People still love us. You just have to get through this, and things will be as they were, and wasn't that great. And the other way to look into a mirror is, of course, as catharsis, to look into it honestly and kind of go, you know, I need to get down the gym, or I need to change my diet or whatever. And it doesn't take a genius to work out which is the more useful way of looking into that mirror. Now, the whole world has been given a lesson in my specialism, which is systems change and interconnectedness and interdependence. And that's really great, because now we're starting to have, I think, some proper conversations about this crisis and how we got here and how we can get out of it if we can. I quite like a quote by Andy Groves, the ex-CEO of Intel. He said, look, bad organizations are destroyed by crises. Bad organizations are destroyed by crises. Good organizations survive them, but great organizations are improved by them. And so there's a lot of talk now about innovation and how we go about doing that kind of stuff. And I get hired a lot because apparently, as well as being a reluctant futurist, I'm also an innovation expert, whatever that means. And right now, my phone's been ringing off the hook because we've got whole organizations who've literally spent their entire lives crushing innovation out of their organizations, mostly because they built companies and organizations around the idea of some form of stability. And they have totally removed diversity, particularly from the boardroom. And if you see any of the research, diversity and innovation go hand in hand. So what is innovation really? I have my own definition I use. I don't claim that it's complete, but it's the starting point I use with my clients. And my definition is innovation is the culture of asking the right questions. You know? And unfortunately, most organizations do not ask themselves the right questions. They essentially ask themselves the question, how can we do what we did yesterday with a little bit more margin? Okay, and that's not the kind of question we need to be asking right now. But it's very difficult to ask you to get out of that silo thinking and ask yourself the questions you don't know you should be asking yourself. How do you do that? How do you ask the questions you don't know you should be asking yourself? I mean, I like to say that if you want to find the nearest prejudiced person, look in the mirror. We're all hidebound by the skin we grew up in, where we grew up, what part of the world, the technology that was around when we were growing up, the politics that was around, the arts, everything. It totally sort of molds us. Napoleon Bonaparte said this very well. He said, tell me what the world was like when my enemy was 20, and I will know exactly how to defeat me. And nowhere in any ethics course or philosophy course can I find anything that teaches us how to get out of ourselves and ask ourselves the questions we don't know we should be asking ourselves. And so I developed a series of techniques for doing this with some of my clients. And one is particularly relevant right now. And it's something I stole from a man called Rodney Brooks. Rodney Brooks is a very successful scientist and entrepreneur in a number of fields. And he's largely responsible for the current artificial intelligence and machine learning revolution. And if you speak to Rodney about how he's been so successful in multiple fields, he says, well, I've got this very simple technique, which is I look at all the assumptions, the rules of the game of any industry or scientific discipline that are there, such that the people in that area don't question them. They're just how things are. And I spent some time just teasing that list out. And of course, a lot of them would be, fairly uncontroversial. I'm a restaurant, I sell food. That's probably not going to change. Because I wait till I've got that entire list and I look down it very carefully. And then I ask myself, which one of these assumptions isn't true? Might have been true when they started, it's not true now. Which one of these assumptions isn't going to be true in a year from now or 5 years from now? And if those aren't true, what questions does that raise? And then I set myself the task of answering those questions, because I'm asking questions ahead of the game that my competitors aren't asking. And that's how I'm so successful. And now is an excellent time to do this, of course, because when it comes to assumptions about how the world works, they've pretty much been decimated in many areas. So finally, we're asking ourselves some of the right questions about the future, I think. And it's really invigorating for me. I'll come on to some examples in a minute. Right now, the impossible, I think, is more impossible. So it's more possible than it's ever been. Like, if you an example, I've got a client who went from 20 million pounds revenue a week to zero overnight as a result of the pandemic. That held up the mirror to themselves and their processes and their management and the way they were dealing with things. And they used this time to really have a good old look. And what they've done as a result is they've decided that they're going to be the world's first regenerative business in their sector, to put more back into the environment and more back into the communities that they serve than they actually take out. And they said to me, financially, we're feeling a bit unwell. But strategically, we now feel like an Olympic athlete. We know where we're going. We're going to really go for it. So guess what? If you want to win business with that company, you better have a great story now about sustainability, governance, ethics. Otherwise, you're off their supply list. I'm working with the Ministry of Defence at the moment on their climate change strategy. And as you probably all know, the military in any nation is usually one of the biggest customers. And I can tell you very clearly that their procurement requirements are going to change radically quite soon in the next few years, particularly because we've got the climate change conference coming up next year, and they're going to want to make some pretty bold announcements about what they expect from their suppliers. And when the military changes in the world, that often has a knock-on effect of changing the entire market. BlackRock, the world's biggest investors, have said, look, if you're not managing these risks well, these social risks and these climate risks, we're going to stop investing in you. Okay, I mean, they're a founding member of the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which is led by Mark Carney. And the ideas in that task force are going to be increasingly put into law over time. So, that's the way the world is going. Unilever right now is building a system where suppliers have to declare the carbon footprint of their goods and services. And Unilever say, we will prioritize suppliers who have got science-based emission reductions targets so that we can make ourselves net zero by 2039, and we want to make ourselves completely free of deforestation in our supply chain by 2023. And if that's not incentive enough, which is, the carrot in trying to get business off those people, the law is going to come after you now. So I work with an organization called Client Earth, and there is a whole bunch of existing financial and environmental law that tells you that legally you should be doing some stuff. The fact is that nobody enforces it, but Client Earth do, and they're getting increasingly well funded. And they've gone after governments and corporations and just said, look, the stuff you're doing, you've been doing without anybody holding you to account on this stuff. And now we will. An example from that world, not even by Client Earth, but another organisation, took the Dutch government to court, took the entire government to court. And the entire government had to change its entire climate change strategy because it was breaking its own environmental legislation and its own future generations legislation. And now the Dutch have had to introduce a carbon tax, which is going to increase in value over the next 10 years. So it's very likely that many of the proposals that you've written already sell products and services that break environmental and public health law. It's just no one's come after you yet. But in the future, they're going to. Now, the good news is, I think, that there are very few moments in history where sentiment changes on a global scale. There's never going to be a moment like this in our careers ever again, where suddenly change is afoot, where something different is possible. Okay, so my argument with all of my clients, whether that's the cabinet office or whether it's a corporate or whether it's Médecins Sans Frontières who I work with, it's like, if you're not going to be bold now, when? We have a real chance for a course correction now in our relationship with the planet and with each other. And as Seth Godin rather brilliantly said, there are two types of organizations as we go into the future: the brave and the dead. So if the crisis is a mirror, okay, how are we going to look into it? Are we going to look into it as catharsis and say to ourselves, I'm going to take the things I care about at home into work, social justice, my children's future, equality, climate change. Am I going to take that into work and start to embed that in everything I do? Or I'm going to look into it as Narcissus, just think everything's fine as it is, we just have to get back to normal. And that, of course, is a road to destruction. Now, the good news is that we do have a way out of this. We have the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. That's 17 goals that basically the UN says we have to fix in the next 20 or 30 years if to have any chance of surviving in any decent form as a species. Now, they're not perfect, but they're a pretty good roadmap of where we need to go. And so if the organizations you work for are not advancing one of those goals, at least, without damaging or compromising any of the others, then it's probably pointless. And you need to go and work somewhere else. Because let me tell you, every single government in the world is going to be passing legislation to advance those goals to one degree or another over the next 5, 10, 15 years. And the pandemic has just accelerated that, particularly if you look in Europe. Okay. So if I were to say that to you as an investor, where would you put your money? And indeed, I'm an investor, and I put my money in organizations that advance the Sustainable Development Goals. And I outperform any of the investors that I know. It's really simple, okay? Where would you put your career? Where would you think, which organizations do I want to go and work for? The polluters? The people who just think profit is the thing that we need and sod all the rest? What career advice would I give my children? You know, I love the quote from Peter Drucker. He said, look, profit for an organization is like breathing for a human being. You have to have enough of it, otherwise you're out of the game. But if you mistook your life for an exercise in breathing, you'd rather be missing the point. So now I think in this moment, in this next year or so, as the pandemic really plays out and the recession really starts to hit, now is actually the time for bravery, personally and professionally, to consider something anew and come out of it doing something that we think is worth passing on to our children. And I do know there is no bravery without fear. Okay? But I have this rule I live by, and excuse the profanity, but my rule is fear is hard, but regret is a fucker. Okay? You do not want to think 10 years from now, there was a moment where things could have changed, where we could have gone bold on all the stuff we really care about, and I decided to sit back and just play it normally and keep the status quo. That's not what you want for your legacy. We must start to see this long emergency as actually the big opportunity. I'm just going to finish off with a couple of quotes from two of my favorite people, one alive, one dead. The one who's alive is my great friend Ed Gillespie, who's another reluctant futurist. And he says, look, if you want to change the world, you've got to have more fun than the other people who are trying to keep it the same. You've got to have more fun than they are, and you've got to let them know you're having more fun while you're doing it. I like to say that people on the right side of history, actually, in my experience, the people who are really trying to change things, they're much more interesting people. They've got passion, they've got desire, they're willing to shake things up. I like to say that people who are doing that kind of stuff, they go to more parties more often and have more sex with more interesting people. If that doesn't get you on the right side of history, I don't know what will. And the final quote is from Catherine the Great, who at another time of enormous historical change said this rather brilliant thing. She said, a great wind is blowing that either gives you imagination or a headache. And my brief today was to give you a bit of both. So I hope I've done that. And thank you very much for your attention. Back over to Pete, I think.
Thanks, Mark. Absolutely wonderful. Thank you for kicking us off in such style. While you've been talking there, on the screen right next to you that I can see, there's a load of questions coming in. Because we're a little bit delayed on the tech, I'm only going to pick two. So the first one we have is from Isabel. And Isabel says, I'd be really interested in Mark's views on how people seem to be less hardy or more fragile today than they were 10 years ago. What do you think about that?
Oh, what a great question. I mean, it's an interesting perception, because I think it depends where you are in the world.
Yeah.
I think some of us have got very comfortable. You know, we've had an unprecedented, in the UK, for instance, we've had unprecedented peacetime. We've had quite a lot of prosperity. In fact, I was asked recently in an interview, what was your big break? You know, I think people thought I was going to say, oh, my first book or whatever. And I said, actually, my big break was I was born white male out of poverty into a country with a functioning government. What more could you possibly want? So if you go around the world, actually, I think people are a lot more robust. So I think, comfort is, and I've had this argument with a lot of my clients. You got very, very comfortable, and being comfortable does not breed innovation. So and also we've got this idea now that, you can't be offended, can you? Can't offend anyone. Our ability to sort of actually argue nicely. But this is polarization. A lot of that, I think, is down to the way the press works, because polarization is cheap journalism, was actually bringing people together to think carefully about things is expensive. And a good example of that recently is the climate assemblies, which have just announced their results yesterday. Brought all these different people. If that had been done by the press, those people would now be rampant climate deniers or absolute eco-activists. And actually, they came together and came with something brilliant. So I think division is cheap. And one of the things we have to do as individuals is kind of realize that I'm willing to be offended in the cause of understanding that person better.
Fantastic. Wonderful answer. I am literally going to... Oh, here they come. Now they're all coming through. I'm going to pick one, which is an absolute belter from Catherine. Is Mark talking about a reversal back from the shifts we made as a result of the industrial age? Will the current pandemic eventually see us move to better communities all over again?
What a fantastic question.
It's a belter, isn't it?
It goes right back, actually, to Adam Smith. So if you looked at when Adam Smith came up with the Wealth of Nations, which is essentially the kind of the economic model of specialization and all that kind of stuff that we kind of work under now, there was a very large debate amongst him and other philosophers at the time. And if you go back and read those letters that were sort of exchanged, A lot of the other people were saying, Adam, this is a work of genius. The Wealth of Nations is a wonderful example and a wonderful way of thinking about how we can be more efficient and specialize. But it says it looks wonderful on paper. It just looked like it might be awful for human beings. And as it turned out, it was. And what we found out in the pandemic, actually, is community is a much more important thing. And actually, here's an interesting thing. The biggest indicator of whether you're going to live a long and happy life is not whether you quit smoking, not whether you have a good diet. I mean, those things are important. I'm not suggesting you don't do those things. But actually, it's how socialized you are, how good your personal relationships are, and how good your relationships are within your community. So I don't think we're going to throw away all the technology, but certainly one of the things that might be happening is we're seeing a much bigger focus on local connection. And actually, in all the work I've done, particularly in my second book, you tend to find that it's community examples where what I call bottom-up diverse collaboration that generally does systems change quite well. And that requires different types of leadership. It requires different kind of investment. It's slightly heavy on as an overhead to manage when you're managing a very diverse bunch of people, but the return on investment is enormous. So I think we may well have a shift in that direction. We may not. The status quo is terribly well funded, and they made a lot of money out of keeping us separate, thinking of us as atomized consumers and keeping us unhealthy. We now have to fight against that. So in that way, the pandemic might well be on our side.
Mark, that's absolutely wonderful. Like I said, there's a ton of these. If we had like another hour, we'd probably still be here. So I just wanted to say you're the first person who's ever spoken at a BIDx. So thank you so much for doing that. We thoroughly enjoyed hearing it here in the studio. I hope everybody did who's kind of logged in. Thanks for doing it, Mark. Have a wonderful weekend. Let's hope that we hear from you again soon. Cheers, Mark.
Thanks, Pete.
Thanks very much indeed. Mark Stevenson, ladies and gentlemen. What a way to start. Absolutely extraordinary. Now, thank you, by the way, for those amazing questions. There were tons I could have asked Mark, and keep them coming. Now, our next speaker, our next guest, works in two areas, people and disruption. So it's pretty likely that she's been fairly busy over the last few months. She used to be the HR director on the exec board at the BBC, and that was during one of the most turbulent periods in the BBC's history. Before that, she was the HR director at Serco. But it was really her time at the BBC that she became openly frustrated with the lack of innovation in the HR world. She wanted to find new ways to tackle what were very old problems, so she created disruptive HR. She now helps leaders and businesses do things very differently. I'm hoping, ladies and gentlemen, as I'm sure you are, that we're about to go live to our second guest, Lucy Adams. Lucy, are you there?
I am. How are you doing?
Glory be, Lucy. Thank the Lord.
It works.
It works for now. So listen, I'm going to jump off. I know that because of the delay, you're not able to do any questions for us at the end. So I'm going to minimise my talking. Lucy, it's all yours.
Oh, well, thanks ever so much, Pete. And I hope the guys who are managing the tech have all kind of your heart rates come down a bit. There's just nothing worse, is there? So a fantastic introduction from Pete. That's really kind of him. I mean, Mark calls himself a reluctant futurist. I kind of shorthand introduction for me is to say I'm a recovering HR director. And as Pete mentioned, I've worked in some fairly large organizations. I worked at the BBC, but also Serco. And my first job in Serco, and indeed one of my many roles at Serco, was actually on bids, working on bids. And it was a really happy time. I worked in the rail side, also worked in a bit in defence and the prison side. And I think it's fascinating because when I kind of reflect back on the work of the bid team, and okay, so we were typically working in quite large bid teams, and I know some of you are one-man bands or much smaller, but actually we were incredibly agile. You know, we were having to be incredibly responsive and flexible. We had teams of people coming together, working in a very, very short space of time, and had to work effectively in that short space of time to produce what the client needs. We worked, ridiculous hours. We weren't kind of the 9 to 5. No matter how well prepared we were always submitting the bid, working on it and photocopying stuff at 3 o'clock in the morning on the night before deadline. But I think, we were incredibly agile. Sadly, most organizations and the ones you'll be bidding to aren't. We have got incredibly traditional ways of leading, managing, engaging our people. And even with the current crisis, in some ways kind of sweeping away a lot of the resistance to changing the way we work. You only have to think about working from home and how, perhaps some of the more traditional managers were very reluctant to allow this, who have now just had to accept it. Even with the crisis, actually, most organizations in the way that they manage, engage, lead, reward, develop their people are still very 1980s. And, you hear a lot at the moment about returning to normal. When are things going to get back to normal? And I think we kind of have to ask the question in terms of, the organizations we work with or the way that we do our own work is, do we really want to go back to normal? Or, as Mark's been articulating, do we want to use this hopefully unprecedented global crisis to change things fundamentally? Now, whereas Mark was talking to you about real mega stuff like, the planets and the economy and, social, communities and so on, I'm actually going to get quite pedestrian and talk about just the stuff we do at work and the way that we manage ourselves and the way that we manage and lead other people. And what I want to do is to kind of give, I suppose, some insights about how we can do it differently and what are the key trends that we're seeing. And a lot of these trends we were seeing before the crisis, and we're seeing them accelerate very rapidly now. And the framework that I want to give you to kind of understand that is called the EACH model. And the EACH model stands for employees. Okay, so I know in this case you may not be employees, but people would work just as well, as adults, consumers, and human beings. And I just want to talk you through some of those key trends that we're seeing about different ways of leading, engaging, managing either ourselves or working with other people that we're seeing that I think are going to be absolutely vital. They were vital before, but they're even more essential given the crisis that we're in and that we're no doubt going to go into as we progress over the next few months and years. So if we start off with this idea of adult to adult, kind of, you might think, well, of course we're adults, but actually most organizations, most teams, most leadership is incredibly parental. We have two types of parent. We have the caring parent, which is very much about indulging, spoon feeding, looking after our people, the notices on the walls saying, now wash your hands. We have this kind of sense that we need to really take care of people. It comes from a good place, but actually it's very corrosive because what we're doing with that parenting is that we're assuming that people aren't actually capable of using their own judgment and behaving responsibly. When I was at the BBC, just a kind of very stupid example, I hadn't been there very long and it started to snow. And one of my team came up to me and said, "Oh, Lucy, it's time to write the all staff email." And I was like, okay, what email is this? And they said, well, when it snows, we write to all our people and tell them they should think about going home. I was like, what, they can't look out the window? What happens if they don't get the email? Do they just sit there and wait until the snow piles higher and higher? It's like, of course not. They're completely capable of making a judgment about the journey to and from work and the weather. But there was this kind of sense, oh no, we need to protect, we need to take care. So we have the caring parenting that goes on a lot in our workplaces. And then we also have the critical parent. And the critical parent is all about, let's design our rules, our policies, our processes, our styles of behavior to protect ourselves against the worst behaving people in our organization, the 1 or 2% of people who are going to behave badly. And what we do is we take those rules and processes and we extrapolate it and we apply it to everybody, regardless of the fact that sort of 97, 98% of us are actually going to behave well. It's the equivalent of, when you go to a hotel and you check in and you open the wardrobe and they've got those anti-theft coat hangers. You can just imagine it, can't you? The hotel trade are thinking, a few people are stealing some coat hangers. We've got to do something about this. So they create a coat hanger designed around the 1 or 2% of people who are going to steal coat hangers from hotels. Unfortunately, the 98, 99% of us who have no intention of stealing coat hangers now can't get our clothes in and out of the bloody wardrobe. And it's that frustration, that stifling, that compliance passivity that's generated when we parent people, when we treat them like children that aren't capable of looking after themselves, or naughty children. And so actually, in a disrupted world, what we need are people who are going to speak up, take a risk, challenge, who are going to embrace change, who are going to come up with ideas for that change, who are going to respond to customer need, who are going to try something new. And actually, the parenting that we've had in the organizations that we work with and work within doesn't create that. It creates a passive and compliant environment. And that's not what we need for a disrupted world. So what does adult to adult look like? Well, it looks like changes to the way that policies are designed. So we have organizations like Swiss Re. Instead of a detailed, flexible working policy, what they have is one line: own the way you work. Basically they're saying, when you work best. Do you have small children? Do you have elderly relatives? Do you have your own little business on the side? Are you a morning person, an evening person? When's the best time for you to work? You own it, rather than the detailed, flexible working policies. It's things like Gap and Intel and Ford, their approach to social media policies. Instead of detailed lists about what you can and can't do, they say, play nice, use common sense, and if you mess up, apologize and take it down. Because we actually want our people to be going onto social media and acting as employee advocates for us. So it's light touch approach to policy. It's also about a change of idea around the processes that we have in some organizations. Some of you may, for example, have been unfortunate to have been on the end of an appraisal. Singularly, the worst thing that HR has probably ever done to any organization was to introduce the annual performance review. Well, we're seeing organizations like Adobe saying, we're not going to sit you down at the end of the year and give you an end of year rating like a report card. But instead, what we expect is for you to seek out one-to-one conversations with your peers, with your team members, with your boss, and for you to have a conversation, initiate a conversation about how you're performing, how you're collaborating, how you're perceived. It's over to you. You own your career, you own your performance, you know what's best for you. And finally, adult to adult is also about the way that leaders operate. So instead of this idea that leaders have to be bigger, stronger, more knowledgeable than anybody else, actually what we're seeing is the idea that leaders who are thriving and surviving in this disrupted world are those that can get the best from their teams, who enable others to do their best work. Much lower ego leaders. And as a leader, instead of always feeling that you've got to, if your team comes to you for permission or approval, instead of immediately feeling like you have to answer, instead turning it round and saying, I trust you, use your judgment, or I don't know, what do you think? We can be much more enabling, less parental in our style. So adult to adult. The second element, as I mentioned, is consumer. People as consumers, employees as consumers. And of course, in our human lives, in our home lives, we expect a level of customization, personalization that's designed around my needs, my wants, my preferences, my motivations. And yet in the workplace, we kind of get one size fits all. We have one approach to reward, one approach to comms, one approach to learning. Well, actually, we need to customize our workplaces if we're going to get the most from us as people, as workers, as employees, as colleagues. So we're seeing a growth of customization, different ways of providing learning, different communication techniques that tap into the people that actually work with you. And I think as leaders, either of teams or as leaders of ourselves, we need to know our people really well. And I'm not just talking that we know their names and when they started with us and what they can do for us, but what are their, how do they respond to change? How do they respond to threats, rewards? What really matters to them? That way we can adapt and mold our style to make sure we're getting the best out of them. We can customize, we can personalize. Now, one framework you might want to think about using is called the SCARF model. I don't know if you've come across it, but the SCARF model was developed by a guy called Dr. David Rock. And what he did was to look at the way that our brains function in relation to threats and rewards at work. So what he said was there are 5 key threats, and it's helpful to use the SCARF mnemonic. So we respond to threats to our status, to certainty, to autonomy, to relatedness, or fairness. And I'll just explain what I mean by this. But first up, when we're confronted by that threat, what happens to our brains is that it goes into fight, flight, or freeze. So the parts of the brain that we rely on in a crisis and that we need to get us out of this crisis, lateral thinking, problem solving, innovation, open to change, that bit shuts down. And what we need is to reverse that. So we need to know how our team responds to different threats and how we ourselves respond to different threats. So it may be that threat to status is a real biggie for you. Sadly, it really is for me. I have a real problem when something appears to be threatening my status, either as an expert or my role in the organization. You could be having a conversation with a team member and be saying, you're not going to report to me. You're going to report to this person. Same job title, same money, but I'm just moving you down the organizational rung. And you see them react really badly. That's because their brain has gone into fight, flight, or freeze mode. We need to know about this stuff. Threats to certainty. Right now, if you're one of your key threats is threats to your certainty, your level of certainty, you're in real trouble right now. You're really struggling right now. Autonomy is those people who really want to be left alone. The worst thing you can do to them is micromanage them. Or it could be that they have they like the autonomy to work in the way that they want to work. Giving them hot desking is the worst thing you can do to them, because actually what they want is to be able to manage and run and own the way they work. Years ago when I was at Serco, it's old hat now, but at the time it was quite new. We took away offices and it was all open plan. And I remember going down to the rail depot at Derby, and I said, where's Mark? He was the depot manager. And they said, oh, he's in his office. And I said, well, he can't be. We've taken all the offices away. And they said, oh, no, he's built his own. And he built his own out of archive boxes. And because he was an engineer, it was brilliant. But his need to own his own space and manage his own space, vitally important to him. So it could be that you or your team really need that autonomy. That's one of your key threats if something appears to be challenging that. Relatedness is about knowing the people you work with. And so being threatened by a new team leader or a new team member or having to collaborate with a different team. And finally, fairness in the SCARF model, fairness. If something appears to be unfair to us or to somebody that we care about, that can create a lasting damage. It's very often why you see when somebody's gone, say, through redundancies, round of redundancies, the people who weren't affected by the redundancy, who still have jobs, can leave 6 months later because they witness things that perhaps they believe to be unfair and their relationship with their organization is damaged. So know your threats, know your rewards, and know those threats and rewards of your team. Which are the ones that matter most to them? Because it could be you're inadvertently giving out those threats. We have to customize our style to understand based around the needs of the people, the motivations, the preferences, the wants of the people that we work with. So adult, consumer, and finally human. And, you know, I think during this pandemic, we have seen actually amazingly human behavior from our leaders. You know, sometimes we've seen them as a bit like, you know, automatons, perhaps a bit sterile, sitting there in meetings, you know, suited and booted, and perhaps quite not particularly vibrant in their approach, and certainly not very human. Well, you know, the fact that we're now having to do stuff over Zoom, and we're seeing their kids run in and the cats walk across the screen, and they're having to try and be as professional as the rest of us, and struggling with it. We've seen that human side of it, and it goes down really well. You know, engagement levels are up across the board. The way that we're interacting, when a leader asks you, you know, how are you, and has actually meant it for the first time, rather than it being a precursor to giving you a set of tasks, we've seen amazing human behaviors, you know. And when we look at those human behaviors that are actually going to sustain us, it's not about kind of commercial acumen, and it's actually about the ability to trust. It's about optimism, because that's at the core of resilience. And it's also empathy, to really understand what is going on for the people around us. There was a great Harvard Business Review article a little while ago that looked at those organizations that were thriving in the then disrupted world, which of course now seemed really boring and stable. And actually the things that came through were those leaders who had the ability to get more from others through trusting them, through showing empathy, and those who had unbelievable resilience because they had a level of optimism. I'm not talking about kind of Pollyanna-ish, it's all going to be fine, but those leaders, those individuals who could see the opportunity and challenge in a crisis, that could see that actually there could be a way out of it. Who could see that there might be a different way of doing it, who actually didn't come in and said, oh God, this is all terrible, but, you know, had a level of positivity about them. You know, when I was at the BBC, we went through something, you may remember it, the Jimmy Savile crisis. For those of you who aren't in the UK, Google it. It's a very unsavory tale. But in essence, we were in a very difficult situation as an organization, big reputational crisis. And one of the responses that we did was we actually asked people at the BBC, who are the people, the leaders, the managers, the colleagues that you love working with, the ones that you do your best work for, that you feel more motivated to work for. And these 50 names of managers came up, and we said, what is it that they do? How do they behave? What is it that they do that's different for you to name them? And what came back was, they know my name. Their door's always open. They ask if, you know, how my family is. They have that human connection. They have humility. They say, I'm sorry, I think I got that wrong. They don't take credit for my work. They just behave like really decent human beings. And I think sometimes we can read all of these, you know, rich articles with very complex leadership matrices and so on, and we can kind of really confuse ourselves with how we need to develop as professionals. But actually, I believe that the thing that will really matter to get us through this, to help us evolve on an individual, but also on an organizational level, is that we behave like really decent human beings. Now, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to stay for questions because of the delay, the half-hour delay. I've actually got another client session that I'm running, so I don't want to be late for that. But if you're interested in following up on anything that I've talked about and you felt that you wanted to ask a question, you can connect with me on LinkedIn. I'd be more than happy to answer that, or drop me a line on Twitter, or just have a look at our website, disruptivehr.com. There's a load of free resources on there. Hopefully, there's in this very brief time that we've had, there's been some insights that will help you think about the opportunities for you either as a leader or as an individual. Thanks very much.
Oh, Lucy, thank you so much for that. That was absolutely
pleasure.
Magnificent. Listen, I know you've got to go, right? But we've had a load of questions come in. I'm going to group them together, but you can give me a yes or no answer, right?
Great. I find that really hard, but I will give it a go.
Okay, all right. If you want to give more, I'm happy.
I've got a couple of minutes. Let's do it.
Okay, right. So I've kind of sort of put these together as a bit of a sort of like one question, even though there's loads of them kind of asking the same thing. Is right now, so middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, is this the biggest challenge that leaders will ever face? Yes or no?
Well, I'm not a futurist, so I don't know. I don't know what's around the corner. I think that we should recognise that we are going to have a succession of difficulties. I don't know whether it's a crisis, but I think there is going to be a succession of difficulties. And the old days where we used to kind of have to manage change in this nice linear fashion with a beginning, a middle and an end, and we could map it all out on a Gantt chart, we know those days are gone. So I think that actually what we're looking at is not kind of gearing ourselves up for one big crisis and then relax, is to try and find a way, and I know this is really hard, but to find a way where we remain responsive, and so we're on our toes, but at the same time we are also thinking about the future. Because I know when I was at the BBC, my reaction shots were really good because, you know, if any of you have seen the programme W1A, which is a spoof about the BBC, you know, with the daily damage limitation meeting, those actually existed. So we would have these daily damage limitation, and there was, you know, all these things, this incoming fire would be happening. But actually what we got really good at was dealing with incoming fire. What we were less good at was having the pause, the time to think ahead. And unfortunately, right now we have to do both. So I don't know if this is the biggest crisis. Who knows? I'm not a futurist. I wouldn't pretend to be one. But I do think we've got to recognise that need to be on our toes and at the same time thinking and pausing and reflecting and think more about the future, I think is critical.
Wonderful. You mentioned W1A. We've actually had a couple of questions about W1A come up on the board. And I've got Steve wants to know, very quickly before you go, is there a head of better at the BBC?
There probably is now.
Oh
there probably
my God,
is now.
really?
And one thing, you know, like all the rooms, the meeting rooms that we have, we did actually have a Del Boy room where we ended up having the audit committee once, until one of our board members says, I'm not sure this is the appropriate room to be having the audit committee. So yes, it's very, very real. The only thing we didn't do was sit on seesaws. But yeah, I couldn't watch it for a while because it was my life and it was just too painful.
Really?
But yeah, believe it.
Oh my God. So the guy who gives it the whole, you know, brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. Is there a lot of those? Oh, I'm so happy that there's a lot of those. That's made my day. Lucy, I know you've got to run. Thank you so much for being with us today. I'm sure everybody's going to jump on LinkedIn and social media to contact you. So thank you so much. Have a great weekend.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Lucy. Bye-bye. Wonderful stuff there. I'm so glad there's a head of better. I can't tell you, honestly. Ladies and gentlemen, we are at our final speaker, if you could believe it. And it's an extraordinary thing because we've come to someone here who is quite incredible. We're so lucky to get him here. And he's been, I think it's almost difficult to describe the two challenges that this particular gentleman has been through. He's going to talk about this. I don't want to mention too much about it. He works with some of the biggest businesses in the world. He works with some of the best known Olympic athletes in the world. And the two challenges that he's going to talk about, well, he basically undertook them all in the name of change. He basically is a change expert. And we're going to go straight over to him now. Ladies and gentlemen, Jim Lawless. Jim, are you with us?
Pete, I am, and it's been a wonderful afternoon. Thanks for inviting me along. It's been very stimulating.
Good. I'm glad, Jim, because, you know, you've got an amazing book, which I was reading a couple of weeks ago, Taming Tigers. I know you're going to talk. There's so much that we could talk about with you. So questions, please get them in, our beautiful audience. Jim, I'm going to leave you to it because I know that we're going to completely run out of time. I want you to take the stage. Jim, it's all yours.
Huge pleasure. Thank you very much. And a really good afternoon to everybody. We could really, the topic I want to go into is how do we personally become adaptable, flexible and change? And the challenges I'll speak about were all around me testing ideas around that, which then as an organization, we at Symmetry deliver into organizations to create an ability to be agile. But our model is all based around the fact that we need agile individuals, people who can adapt and flex. And so it's been great listening to the conversations this afternoon. I'm going to do a quick bridge, and then I'm going to get really personal on how we each can take on new ideas, new challenges, be more resilient, be more adaptable, and deliver different things, create changes in our lives. It was fascinating listening to Lucy there. She said, we're not going to change and then relax anymore. It's a constant process, which is I entirely agree with and endorse. Both organizationally, let's park that. But for you and I think, and our children, which is a critical thing for me as a father of a 23-year-old and of a 6-year-old, which is a very long story for another day over a coffee. But for me, very live is how do we give them the tools to enter into a world where flexibility, adaptability, multi-careers, impact of AI, they're going to have to adapt and flex. So how do we help them have that from a really young age? But for me, the most important thing to go back to was Isabel, if you're still with us with the timing, I hope you are. Your question, how come we're becoming less robust? I'm not going to second guess the answer to that. Mark addressed it from his perspective. My interest is in how to become more robust. And, you know, because of that, I've torn up all the rules of being a presenter, especially online. I'm going to start with a graph. So if we imagine that the rate of change around us that we're having to adapt to, whether that's tech, whether that's Trump, Brexit, or whether that's a pandemic, is doing this, the natural rate of a human's ability to adapt hasn't changed. Now, the rate of nuclear physics is probably doing that, and our natural born ability to handle nuclear physics probably isn't changing. So we have a very definite structure in place to help people bridge that gap. And with the greatest respect, I think what we tend to do in the rest of society, you may be different, is to say we've got mental health issues, we've got overwhelm issues, we've got burnout issues, we've got stress at work issues. My strong contention, which is why I've done various challenges to test lots of different ideas, is that actually what we've got is a skills gap. If we're going to ask people to leave the comfort zone, there's a phrase. What do we call the place outside the comfort zone? I mean, I've never heard a name for it. I, with my clients, call it the confusion zone. I call it that with my children. I call it that myself. Day one, when you show up for a new adventure, I decided to become a jockey in 12 months, having never sat on a horse, 3 stone 2 heavy, age 36. That was executed using a model which I'll touch on some of the points from today. But the first day you turn up in a horse racing yard as an overweight Londoner who can't ride, you are immediately in the confusion zone, I promise you. But we don't speak about this. We don't speak about the emotions of that. We don't speak about what will happen to our bodies, what will happen to our relationships when we move into that zone. We have a skills gap. I'd like to touch on it partly today. Let's start with I'm going to keep it simple, I'm going to keep it practical, and I'm going to keep it usable. If you are going to change or adapt, you will need to do something you haven't done before. Do we agree? If we do something we haven't done before, we don't know if we can do it, if it'll go okay, how people will view us, how it'll turn out. Therefore, we're facing uncertainty. I'm hoping you would agree. And if I face uncertainty, I've got a risk. Lucy mentioned the SCARF model, the different types of risk. Let's build on that. Change, new stuff. Don't know if it'll work. I've got risk. Quick show of hands. How many people, when you were 12, 13 years of age, formative years, would have a mum, a dad, whoever cared for you at that stage in your life, who would wave you off in the morning and say, bye-bye, darling. Have a wonderful day today. Be sure and take a risk or two at school with the teachers today. Don't worry if it all goes wrong in front of your classmates, because that's the price of a risk. And we embrace failure around here, don't we? Embrace a bit of failure. I don't know about you, but I didn't have that upbringing. In the days when we used to be able to meet live, I would ask a very similar question. The only place I ever got hands go up on the planet was in the Bay Area of San Francisco, and the occasional stray Californian in Barcelona might put her hand up as well. We were raised to survive in the industrial age. This is very, very important. We were raised to survive in the industrial age. We were raised to show up and be obedient, get it right first time, to the satisfaction of a supervisory figure whose job it was to make sure we showed up and got it right first time. So the management structure, the team leader was a supervisor. They knew what right looked like and could give us a process and make sure we did it. Clock in, clock out. Do you remember that? Then the individuals, our job was to be obedient, not to be accountable, thinking, adaptable, flexible, trying new things live in a dynamic, uncertain environment, face to face with the client. It was a totally different environment. And so naturally, we were trained for that environment. We were educated in lines where we were told to show up and be obedient. I had a badge. We could get a badge at my school. It said obedience on it. So we were trained to be obedient, to fit into that environment. And we've got a lot of what I call industrial age lag, but we're not working in the industrial age anymore. We're working in this incredible, fast-moving, VUCA, dynamic, technologically enabled organization of networks around the world where we create value, which I don't think is a dirty word, and that there are different types of value and different types of costs, and we clearly have to rethink a lot of that. But so we are in this interconnected network now, where our job is to be thinking and owning and accountable in the moment, in a dynamic situation, tooled up to take decisions, adapt and flex. That's our job as the individual. I keep doing this because I'm showing a graph in my head. Let me show it to you, if it is here, and show you what you see what you think. So we've gone from the supervisor coming all the way to the accountable person, and we get the team leader going all the way up to a performance coach, which embodies all the things that Lucy said about somebody who's human, who's humble, who asks questions, who hands accountability back to the individual they're dealing with. And that enables the individual to be adaptable, flexible, owning their own outcomes and moving forward. And we call that an aware person, but that's for another day. So we were brought up for the industrial age. We're operating in this incredible networked economy. So naturally, our education system has radically shifted. Now we train people for the industrial age. And there might be some millennials, even some Gen Zs now tuning in thinking, not me, boomer, I'm different. Firstly, never call me boomer. Gen X, we get forgotten, but we exist. Secondly, I would say, back to Isabel's point, we are raising people and training them more for the industrial age, more to be obedient, get the right answer back, to stay within lines than we have ever done before. So we have an interesting situation. My job is looking at how do we break out of this? What is the machine that we've got as humans, and how do we change mindset, skill set, relationships, and daily actions to produce the new? So I decided to become a jockey in 12 months to experiment this. This was done around my day job. I'm not a rich guy who has time to go do fun things for 12 months. I have children and a house to paint. I decided to take the British freediving record, which was a very interesting trip. I went to 100 meters within 8 months of starting to freedive. And that is a voyage outside the comfort zone and into the confusion zone, only matched by the racing experience. It's changing mindset about the challenge. It's changing skill set. And then it's changing the daily activities that we're going to put into the schedule, and changing relationships around us. We were trained to keep it within the lines. So let's have a little look at this and introduce an idea. We're going to have to start with this radical thought that we're human beings, and we've got a piece of equipment, and we need to understand this and see our colleagues, the people we manage, and most importantly ourselves, as holistic beings. And when I leave the comfort zone and move into the confusion zone, a number of things happen, which is why we talk about psychological safety, but don't always necessarily root it in how we need to understand it. So let's look at our equipment. In very loose, fast terms, in a 20-minute slot, we have the ability, uniquely in the animal kingdom, to have extraordinary levels of purpose. We can decide to do something extraordinary out in the future, have an objective, build towards it, build teams around it, create a vision, legacy, creativity, contribution. We've also got a process. And when we leave that comfort zone and we perceive that threat, Lucy articulated this beautifully, this fires up. So we need a new level of AQ, adaptability quotient, which involves the emotional understanding of what's happening. This has access to our entire emotional system. So when people tell you they feel this, that, or the other, that could be because of something we've done. It could be because they need to regulate how they experience and understand their feelings. Because once we click over into this process, which happens at 20 times this, so there's a flick over mechanism. It happens way non-consciously. It's related to our perceptions, how we see the world. So if somebody says to me, give a presentation to 3,000 people, I say, when and how much? If somebody says to some of my colleagues, give a presentation to 3,000 people, they've gone beneath the desk before the sentence is complete. That's about perception, how they perceive the challenge based on their experiences and skills. And that perception switch will send it into process or purpose, and we can override this. We can choose to feel differently about the situation. This doesn't mean we look in the mirror and say, it'll be fine, because it won't. We're going to need new skills. We're going to need new mindset. We're going to need new relationships supporting us. And we need new tasks in the diary, or this presentation is going to tank. But I can see my way through to adapting. I don't have to go step my foot out of the comfort zone and retreat with a problem. So we have to be able to see that we've got this, this dual system going on and begin to understand it. And then we have a chance of building with that vocabulary how it is we're going to tackle certain changes. So I'd love to take you through the 10 rules for taming tigers, which, as Pete kindly said, are contained elsewhere in a book that's been written. We're going to look at 3 very quickly in the time we've got together to give you more of a flavour of how this works. I'm hoping everything we've done so far has given flavour and layers of understanding already to how it works. Tools you can work with your children. Speaking of tools with children, and need all of us at the moment. Let's look at this. Anxiety. So we say anxiety is bad and we should help people. I'm not speaking about a clinical condition. We're speaking about waking up at 3 in the morning anxious about something. We need to deal with that. It's not a clinical condition. That's the human condition. It's a wonderful evolutionary superpower ringing an alarm bell saying there is something requiring your attention, Jim. You can't afford to sleep. This is wonderful. This is incredible. This is like a sixth sense, driving my emotions in the middle of the night. Now I can react to that in 3 ways. I can act. If you imagine that once this process has started, it's like an engine revving. So I can act, I can engage the clutch on my engine, I can deal with the problem. But I'm going to have to be brave, go out there, face it, change relationships, mindset, skill set, actions in the diary, and go and deal with the problem. Or I can accept I can't deal with this problem. I can't change government policy. I can't personally change climate. So I can do lots, I understand that, but I can't personally change this. I can't take it to bed every night and personally change that. So I might have to learn to accept things. Here we go into mindfulness and yoga and other wonderful things that can help us calm the system down. Turn the ignition off on the engine. Engage clutch, turn it off. Or we can amplify. Now, there's been a lot of this happening during the pandemic, a lot of social media, 24-hour news, no one knows what's going on. So let's find the worst case scenario. Let's find someone who can explain that worst case scenario. And then let's bring out some people to blame for that, be it a scientist, a politician. We've gone towards trying to blame young people. Let's see whether we pull back from that. We can act, accept, or amplify, but how we respond to anxiety, the superpower, will dictate how we move forward. And this is a hugely useful model, again, to have live in our teams. With children, I call this fix it, forget about it, or get in a tiz. Do you want to be in a tiz? Will it help you? Or should we go fix this? Let's fix it. So we can begin to look at, once we've got the vocabulary for the system, at how we're going to be able to adapt when we have to flex. Now, how many people watching have ever seen a film? I'm guessing everybody's seen a movie at some stage, right? They're all kind of the same. We're going to meet a person in their ordinary environment, then they will be required to adapt. Every movie. Maybe some Spanish ones break this, but generally every movie, certainly UK and US, it's the same. That's what's going to happen. We're then going to follow them through this journey of adaptation. They're going to have to change how they think about themselves in the world, mindset. They're going to have to acquire some new skills. And they're going to have to put new stuff in their to-do list for the day. This is going to be a different world. And they're going to have to build new relationships in order to achieve something at the end of it. They're going to act. They're not going to have a tiz in the corner and blame the politicians, because there would be a really dull movie apart from anything else. But Dorothy's got to find her yellow brick road. She's got to move on. The movies give them the event. Something happens. Her house. We know she doesn't like Kansas. She tells us about it in a song. But then the house gets transported. She wakes up in Oz. She's got a metaphorical and spiritual journey up a yellow brick road to grow up, become a woman, and return back to her homeland as an adult. The movies get the event. Adaptation starts with an event. We either create it or we wait for it. Now, the pandemic created it on one level, but whether we have taken the next step in creating our own event to move on from that, that remains to be seen. I don't mean globally from the perspective that Mark brought us. I mean individually. We, as humans, we either wait for the event or we create the event. Most of us will wait. We can wait a lifetime. My argument is, if we're going to adapt, what's the event you need to create? Which means you have to build a new mindset. You have to build a new skill set. You have to begin to change relationships and change what you do on a daily basis in the diary. None of us wants to change what's in the diary. Let's look at that for just a minute. So rule one is to act boldly. We've got to create the event that begins our adaptation. Most of us like to talk about it in the pub and then come up with a great reason why our spouse or boss wouldn't let us move forward with it, or why the children, the current situation, won't let us move forward with it. We're going to have to do somewhat better than that in an age of adaptability. Otherwise, we're always following. A lovely quote from Mark, there's the brave and the irrelevant, or whatever it was, precisely that he said from Seth Godin. Largely the same, I think, for us as humans. There's brave and those who are going to lag behind the curve. So we need to be able to create our own events. Everybody needs to be aware of their perceptions as well, or it gets extremely difficult to... So the perceptions will drive the whole process. Whether I believe this presentation could go well or be a disaster. As Henry Ford said, if you believe you can or believe you can't, you're probably right. Now, I'm not going to suggest by changing the beliefs, it changes the outcome. We've got to change the situation to change the belief, to change the outcome. But that involves a growth mindset, if you will. So we have to be aware, why am I seeing the boss as somebody who would block me from initiating change in processes that will deliver a rapid, adaptable client experience? Have I had the conversation with the boss and explained it carefully and given them all the perspective? So it could be we've got an issue with another human being. It could be our perception of the hierarchy in the environment is driving an emotional response. We have to be able to analyze perception. Then we have to be able to move towards the end point. And this is critical. There's the last 2 points I'm going to raise at some pace. Everybody says with a free dive, which is just a journey out of the comfort zone, way into the confusion zone, in order to experience my body saying, process, process, process. And I've got to have the mental capacity and the emotional regulation to say, purpose, purpose. I'm not flicking this switch. Even at 100 meters, under 11 times the Earth's atmospheric pressure, the switch is not going to flick into adrenaline emotion because I've got a significant problem at that stage. I've got to stay calm. So this ability to manage that system becomes key. Everybody says that 100 meters under the ocean, I guess the process is going crazy. It's not. My process did kick off. I call it the tiger. The tiger did roar at me. But the tiger roared at the beginning, at the outset, when I looked at my schedule, and it's full. I've got 2 children, I've got a house to build, I've got a business to look after, I've got relationships, I've got clients to service. There is no time to take the British freediving record. And so I can't do it. The biggest challenge at chief executive level and right through the organization, at Olympic athlete level, is the schedule's full. I can't do the new stuff to create the change. To adapt, the easy part is adding the new. The difficult part is deleting the old. What can you remove from the schedule? What can you let go? You've got to let it go. And that's tough. Indeed, anybody else who's got a 6-year-old daughter will know how tough it can even be to say the words, let it go. Anybody not with me has not seen the movie Frozen 476 times. We love what's in the schedule because we perceive that that is keeping us safe. We do not want to let that go. So another principle we'll bring in, acting boldly, understanding the rule book, the perception, understanding the systems that we've got running underneath the hood of our own engines, our own bodies, our own humanity. And then being able to understand that we're going to have to let things go, which will kick the emotions off if we're going to deliver new things. And let me close by taking you free diving. So we'll go to 100 meters under the ocean, the most beautiful place on the planet. This is not a macho exercise. It's a really wonderful meditation. This is in real time. So if you would like to come with me on the dive, please take a couple of big, ugly tummy breaths, not chest breaths, tummy breath, yoga breaths. And then you can come with me now as the World Governing Body judge there from AIDA sets me on my journey. If you start to feel weird, please breathe, breathe, breathe. There are no prizes. I'm guessing you're all quite competitive. There is a decision I have to take at the beginning of the dive, the beginning of the move outside of my comfort zone into the edges of the confusion zone, to come back changed, to come back with a lot of money raised for pediatric medicine. My oldest daughter had a trouble at the time, and this was a charity fundraiser first of all, and having successfully proven some neurological points about moving through adaptation and change. Big prize at the end of the comfort zone, the confusion zone. I have to take a decision at the outset. The decision is, I'm now going to 100 meters and coming back. Unless there's an emergency, in which case we come home incredibly quickly. This is not a macho undertaking. It's a meditation. Problem, we abort it like a mountaineer. No problem. I have to know I'm doing the job. I cannot decide I'm going to go to 80 meters and when I get there, I'm going to stop. I'm going to have a little think. I'm going to see how I feel and decide whether today's the right day for me. Because if I stop at 80 meters under the ocean and I ask my purpose to just check in with my process and see whether we'd like to click over, find a problem, release some adrenaline, start worrying about it and come home, it will oblige. This is the most beautiful meditation. It's a hug from the planet. At 100 meters, I'm under 11 times the Earth's atmospheric pressure. I'm being squeezed. My lungs shrunk down to the size of my clenched fists. This is entirely normal. We're like dolphins. We're totally capable of doing this. The diaphragm, the muscle that separates my tummy from my chest, has been sucked up into my chest cavity. And that means that my belly's been sucked in by the vacuum. And that means that at 80, 90, 100 meters under the ocean, ladies and gentlemen, you look fantastic. If we could stay like this, you'd be free diving with me. But we can't. It's a beautiful thing, but if I stop and worry about being down there in the dark on my own with nothing to breathe, I'm coming home. We have to commit to crossing the confusion zone. This can be not a long-term 8-month project. It can be to enter into a difficult conflict conversation with a person in authority in order to have what we need to have established to move forward. If we're going to adapt, we must change our mindset, how we see the challenges and the possibilities. We must change our skill set, the ability to execute new things. We must change our relationships. People need to come with us or move on or understand a different perspective. I'm going to have to change what goes into the diary. I'm going to draw us to a close at that stage. Sorry, this movie has sparked up again. I'm going to draw us to a close. It was a huge pleasure being with you. And let me go back to Pete now in the studio. Thank you.
Jim, my great God, that was absolutely 22 minutes of pure joy there and pure gold. Thank you so much for that.
I'm delighted you enjoyed it. Thank you. Well,
listen, I know that it went well because of the amount of stuff that I'm getting on the other screen, which is the feed from everybody who's watching it. So I'm going to pick two things out here. The first one I think is really, really relevant for the audience. There's 4 or 5 of these, so I'm going to kind of sort of bring them all together.
Sure.
Obviously, you're talking to bid and proposal teams who very often find that, well, they find themselves all the time in a winning or losing situation. There's no second. You've either got the gig or you haven't. So there's a lot of questions around, if you lose something, how do you embrace failure in a productive and realistic way, so that rather than just, oh, well, we learnt some lessons along the way and it kind of didn't work out this time, there is actual learning that you can move forward. I think so many questions on how do you actually embrace a defeat?
So I don't embrace a defeat,
right?
And I'm not keen on the vocabulary. However, there are some zero-sum games. We win a bid or we lose a bid. And my background is law. My first job out of private practice in the City of London was with ICL, now Fujitsu, and I worked on bids. So we bidded for Romanian Railway IT infrastructure. So I'm very familiar with win-lose. We won Romanian Railways. We lost Bulgarian passports. So we go on. So I'm very, very familiar with that. First of all, I think we don't embrace failure. We accept it might happen and that we're going to have to be resilient to that. But we don't embrace it. We must, of course, learn from it, and that's down to humility as well. So an awful lot of this comes back to things that I would entirely speak about, but I won't today. Lucy did it beautifully. How do we become, and Mark did to an extent as well, the same topic, how do we become more humble, accepting feedback? We are a conduit for delivering an objective and a purpose here. And so if we need to find out how to do it better, we can. So let's learn from it. Let's get feedback. Let's be humble. Let's not go repeat mistakes. Wonderful jockey called Mick Kinnan. I mean, my absolute hero when I was training, and I didn't know anything about racing. I discovered this guy. And the British Racing School in Newmarket, there's a picture of Mick Kinnan, won the Derby many times. I'm just a genius jockey. Underneath it says, all jockeys make mistakes, but the greats make it once. So we reflect, we understand, we take the feedback, we have the humility, we move on, having dealt with the skill gap if there is one. So I don't embrace failure. I will accept it as something that's going to be inevitable, but it's at the end point as well. Along the way, I'm going to be much more forgiving of myself or anybody else if we're slipping up regularly. I made a lot of mistakes on a horse in the first 6 months. We can call that failure. We can do it as rapid feedback if you wish. But then we've got the big win-lose. Did I win the race? Did I get the book published? Did I win the bid? I'm not embracing failure there. I'm working all out to avoid it. I mean, I'm really, that lack of willingness to embrace it gets me up at 5 in the morning when necessary to perform. But we have to accept in some zero-sum games, I bid frequently for jobs like this, and I'll lose some.
Brilliant. I'm going to try and get 2 more in, Jim, because there's so many. I'm going to slightly change the wording of this one from Eve. Thank you, though, Eve. Are you ever too old to learn?
No. Oh, no. Listen, we've inherited a lot of industrial age nonsense from the past. So never too old to learn and never too old to change. I've spoken about one of my heroes. Sorry, there happen to be 2 males. They happen to be right. There are many others. But Lord Foster of Thames Bank, Norman Foster and Partners. I mean, an absolute, I cannot express my admiration for that man, and at the age of, I think he's 87 now, he's running Foster and Partners. He does an annual ski marathon. He still flies aircraft and glides and cycles competitively. So never too old to learn. And now this becomes an investment in how we look after ourselves. So we might, a different topic, but I learned through racing and through freediving the value of stubbing out a cigarette, which was a big thing of mine. I personally don't drink alcohol for the last decade. It just gets in the way of stuff that I want to do with my life. And I couldn't go a day without either a serious exercise or if it's a day off, a 3-mile walk. I mean, I just, so for me, those are important parts of how I ensure that I am on the ball to move, change and learn. Please, can we let go of the idea that there's some age by which we slow down. Once you start building neural pathways as well, the speed at which you can do that begins to return. It will never be what it was age 12, of course, even younger. I mean, we're making the first viral connections, but it will still come back. I mean, we know this. We can prove it in science now. We can go into neuroscience. And
wonderful. Wonderful, Jim. Now, listen, just at the end of that, I'm going to do one more very, very quick one because I think it's a really, really relevant one. I've got a couple of these. You mentioned letting go just in the last answer there.
Yes.
Martin, among others, has asked, when you took these 2 challenges on, what did you let go of in your schedule? So what went first?
Okay, massive. I mean, firstly, this year I've let go of speaking. I mean, I'm here and I'm delighted with it, but my whole sales and marketing effort is in a different direction now. Because so it's been very interesting how the decision to let go of that. You don't get me wrong, still it's a complete joy to do it. My ideas are as fresh and I'll put as much effort in as ever, but I won't be flying to Vegas anytime soon trying to, it's a different, so letting go happens continuously. To answer, I think it was Martin's precise question, I had to look at my schedule. There was no possible way, as somebody who was leading a training and development company at the time, that I could sell to clients, deliver for clients, manage my team, do the accounts and turn up every morning at 5:30 to ride racehorses or to learn to ride racehorses. I went to see a coach, a sports coach who looked at this with me as well. One of the first people to highlight this as an issue, letting go. And he said, your biggest problem isn't your weight, isn't that you can't ride horses. So you don't have time to do this. So go away and work out what you can cut. I came back and the only thing I could find to cut was selling. I was spending a lot of time speaking to forgive me, middle management, training and development executives who would spin me along for 6 months producing proposal after redraft after redraft after meeting before moving jobs and saying, well, I'm gone now, so start again with somebody else. I mean, it was my life. So I found a channel to market. I moved into the speaking agents environment. I worked incredibly hard to build a small number of relationships, and that's lasted until February 2020, where that was my main modus operandi. That served me for 15 years. That culled all sales. I would just appear on the telephone, we'd have a brief and we'd move on from there. That isn't an option for everybody. We've got to be creative with where we're at. But that was what, to answer the question very specifically, that cleared up 3 days of my week. But I did go through a hockey curve.
Jim, listen, I wish we could continue. We've got so many questions for you. I am, as I said right at the start in your intro, going to direct people to your website that I can see right behind you. And if anybody's got any questions, presumably you're happy to send messages and all of that stuff.
Like coming in LinkedIn, Twitter, as with the other lovely and great speakers today, I'm delighted to engage. So you'll find me on LinkedIn and we can be chatting in 20 minutes and answering some of this together if you wish.
Awesome.
With pleasure.
Jim, listen, thank you for closing the first ever BIDx. It was truly remarkable. Jim Lawless, everybody.
Thanks for the invitation. Thanks to everybody at APMP and all the audience. Have a great weekend. Goodbye.
Wonderful. Cheers, Jim. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, there we have it. Our time together is sadly at an end. But we will be back. Oh, yeah, we'll be back. On Friday, October the 16th. Put it in the diary now. Friday, October the 16th. My wife's birthday, ladies and gentlemen. That doesn't matter, I'm going to be here. Please also note that our 2020 virtual award show takes place in December, but the closing date for your nominations is October 14th. If you haven't nominated someone who you think deserves it, don't hang around, we really don't have long. If you've got any feedback, any questions, any observations, it goes without saying we'd love to hear from you. Just go onto the survey feature on the app and help us out. Feedback is, ladies and gentlemen, as you all know, the food of champions. Now, you can also engage with us and other people watching today's show on all the various discussion groups that are running on the app right now. Many of you will already know we have 3 BIDx discussion forums planned for September 14th, 16th and 21st. Unbelievably, all of these are either fully booked or we have just a handful of places left. So by massive popular demand, we're going to put another date in very soon. Please keep looking at the app and the social medias for our new date. Ladies and gentlemen, that is all we have. We are out of here. Wherever you are in the world, stay safe, stay well, stay happy. From the BIDx studios here in wonderful Manchester, have a great weekend. We'll see you next month. Goodbye.